Once upon a time in the galaxy's endless night, there was a light that would not be allowed to go out. It was not a small light, not a candle on a windowsill or a lantern in a storm. It was a light set in the hands of a god, halogen and holy, a pulse of ritual fire that burned across the gulfs between suns. For 10,000 years that light had been kept alive by the faith of millions, by the grind of engines and the hush of prayer, by the scream of Bolter and the whispered rites of the temples. They called it the Astronomicon, the star that bleeds light, a lighthouse for lost souls drifting on tides of vacuum. It bled not because it was wounded, but because it was given, offered stubbornly, so that others might find their way home. Listen closely, and you can imagine that light. It is not only brightness, but a tone, a deep, even hum that runs beneath the static of space like a harp string plucked by the hand of time. Spacefarers tell of it in half-remembered metaphors. A beacon that tastes of iron and incense, a pulse felt through the bones, a glow that erases the shape of one's loneliness for a moment and replaces it with something like safety. The Imperium, when it moves and breathes, speaks in that tone. The Imperium is a cathedral the size of eternity. Imagine altars that are entire planets, spired and black and crowned with cathedrals of concrete and bone. Imagine corridors of orbital manufactories whose furnaces never sleep, and cathedrals whose stained glass is nothing but pitted armor and votive icons burned into pitted steel. Imagine a faith so enormous it is both system and scripture, law and liturgy. The Imperium moves like a procession, great columns of habit and habitus, an army wrapped in prayer and armor. From the soaring pulpits of Administratum to the silent sanctums of the Adeptus Mechanicus, people bow not only to rulers but to ritual. The shaping of industry into worship, of worship into ordinance, of ordinance into survival, and into that vast, ordered place go the keepers of the flame. They are not one kind of keeper. They wear the mantle in different guises, and the name you give them changes the way the light reflects off their faces. Space Marines walk as angels of iron, towering, disciplined, stripped of names and granted titles carved into their armors. Tech priests move like clockwork saints, their flesh grafted with gears and prayers, their hands more accustomed to the caress of servitors than to the touch of another human palm. Inquisitors stride down corridors with eyes like cold solvents, tasting secrets and dissolving treachery with a single signature. Together, they are a chorus of guardians, a choir that hums the hymns of vigilance. Imagine a hall where they gather, vaulted ceilings ringing with the toll of warning bells, the air heavy with machine oil and incense, the taste of ozone mixed with the bitter tang of burnt votive wax. There are banners here that have been mended and remended until the cloth is a palimpsest of oaths. There are reliquaries filled with bolt casings and bone fragments, venerated as if they were saints. A child of the Imperium is taught to kneel before such things and to make one small, clean gesture of submission. The sign of the Aquila, the two-headed eagle that looks both outward and inward, guardian of empire and of rule. At first, the story is gentle. The voice that speaks now slows and softens, as if reading from a well-thumbed book in a room warmed by a small hearth. You can close your eyes and feel the cadence of the narrator's breath. It is a bedtime story told to steady the hands of recruits and the shaking of old men. There is comfort in the ritual. The machines of the world are tended by priests, and the priests are tended by priests. Everything has its place. Everything that is broken is fixed, and every machine will be made whole again because that is what the machine god demands. There is honor here and steadiness, and a kind of austere kindness in the way the Imperium keeps its own alive. But there is another thing the body learns when it lives under the shadow of such a light. Even flame casts shadows. The story moves on, a few lines at a time, each arranged so that the listener's heart settles into a slow, steady banking rhythm. The Space Marines are described now, not as monsters but as men made monument. Once human, their names lent to memory and then unmade by devotion, they move with a grace that is more ritual than motion. They are the Emperor's chosen, carved from the raw bones of war and rebuilt with gene and iron. Their faces are often hidden, but when glimpsed are like icons in half-shadow, stern, beautiful, and terribly lonely. The tech priests are pictured working under dim lights, fingers moving over circuits as monks over scripture. Their hollowed cheeks and metal eyes are rendered with the same calm affection as the child's toy soldier. There is reverence in the description, a sense that what they do is not cruelty but necessity. And the Imperium songs are soft at first. They are hymns hummed in the dark of watchtowers, prayers carried into the void by ships and radio. They say, remember the light, hold fast, keep faith. These are the words that tether people to hope. These are the small cords by which the galaxy is held together. But somewhere between the furnace and the hymn, a small, almost imperceptible sound starts to thread itself into the melody. Perhaps it is only a whisper at the edge of hearing, the flicker of overworked circuits, a regulator shivering like a throat clearing in winter, a vox signal repeating a syllable slightly out of phase. It is not harsh. It does not cry alarm. Rather, it slips into the cadence like a note slightly flat on a grand organ. You might miss it if you were not listening for it. The first signs are the kind that can be explained away. A servo motor that ticks at odd hours. A hymn book whose final page has been eaten by rust. A data slate that replays the same fragment of a sermon until the words seem like a language invented for ghosts. Soldiers laugh about such things over cheap liquor in distant mess halls. Tech priests remark them as the kind of maintenance matter that can be scheduled. There is comfort in explanation. There is safety in the belief that every anomaly has an engineer and every anomaly can be fixed. It is a good, sensible belief, and it is a lie that the universe allows for only so long. Because the Imperium is vast and multi-voiced, there are hundreds of tales like this told in rooms lit by emergency lamps. One such tale speaks of a watchman on the edge of the maelstrom who claimed he heard the Astronomicon not as a light, but as a voice. He said it spoke his name, and then continued in a language he did not understand. Another tale describes a tech priest who discovered a pattern in the data streams, a rhythm that repeated across centuries and ships, like a metronome buried beneath history. A priest in a backwater chapel swore that an old relic began to tick like a human heart. The list grows longer if you listen to the taverns and the temples, to the whispered corners where secrets are exchanged like smuggled cigarettes. Yet always these accounts are spoken with a certain irreverent shrug, softened into the category of superstition. Yet superstition, when you sit with it, begins to look less like error and more like warning. If you stay with it a moment longer, you will notice how the descriptions change. Where once the tech priest's hands were only precise, they become furtive, as if stealing time from the machine to keep the last measure of themselves. Where once space marines are the epitome of calm, their dreams twitch and leak like old hydraulic seals. In the baking heat of distant worlds, the common soldiers carry crosses that are not for faith but for luck. In their mouths the prayers curdle into mutters that sound like names. The veneer of order starts to show hairline fractures. Sensory detail becomes a slow-motion prying of the listener's confidence. It is no longer an abstract description, but a series of small, physical things. The metallic groan of a ritual door closing, the low buzz of augmented limbs in sleep, the faint odor of seared skin mixed with sanctified oil. The narrator leans closer, voice colder by a degree that is almost imperceptible, and speaks of the crackle of a vox transmission that begins at the edge of static and ends in a child's lullaby. It is as if the machinery itself remembers lullabies. It is as if the machines are the only ones left who remember how to be gentle. You are invited to imagine the loneliness that grows in such places. Picture a forge where a tech priest works through a night that should have already been counted on both hands. He oils a limb, and for the briefest moment, touches the warm skin of a servitor by accident and feels a memory he cannot place, of his mother's hand perhaps, or of a small village bell. He cannot hold the sensation, for the augmentations are more immediate. The servitor's eyes flicker and the memory dissolves like steam. That small remembrance, though, chokes him. It is a tiny thing, a human knot dropped in the gears, and it cannot be stitched back without cost. Over time, the story pivots, little by little, away from the comfort of ritual toward a quieter, more sinister curiosity. The voice of the narrator is still gentle, still measured, but the sentences begin to narrow like a tunnel. The world building tightens. Where you before read of whole orders and fleets, now you read of a single helmet, a single chapel, a single person. The transition is slow and deliberate. Dread likes to be introduced as a guest, not a burglar. Small anomalies begin to adhere to one another and form patterns. The Astronomican's light, for instance, is described more and more as a bleeding, not in the sense of wound, but in the sense that it draws offerings. The light is a magnet for devotion, but it also consumes. Pilgrims who draw too close find themselves changed. They come back with their hair gone and their prayers choked on something not quite English. Ships' logs speak in hushed brackets of power cores that whimper instead of whirring, of chronometers that run backwards for a breath. Mechanicums that once measured time in a Toscans now talk of epochs, and in the way they speak you can sense a new humility. The machines are not simply tools but mouths, patient, hungry mouths, and the keepers of the flame remember them. They who stand guard sometimes become the first to notice. A space marine feels a tremor in his armor that is not caused by impact but by something moving within the plating. A tech priest discovers that a cog refuses to be turned, not because it is seized, but because the cog is listening. An inquisitor finds dossiers rewritten, not by hands, but by long sequences of errors that look suspiciously like signatures. Each of these things is recorded, cataloged, analyzed. Each of these items is, for the most part, explained away. A regulator fails. A mind falls to fatigue. A heretic tampers. The universe is tidy that way. It grants solace by offering plausible causes. Yet the most persistent image is small and simple. An old chapel, carved into the flank of a rusted dreadnought. The chapel is kept lit by a single, stubborn candle that never seems to burn away. Pilgrims press their bleeding hands to the iron and whisper confessions that sound like gears turning. When you strain your ears, you can almost hear the candle's flame humming in a frequency that imitates a machine. It is a minuscule discord, a microscopic wrongness. And still, someone comes to tend that candle during every watch. Someone insists on keeping the flame. Someone insists that the light must endure. There is devotion here and there is comfort there. The two are not the same, though they often look alike. The narrator slows down now, folding back into that original lullaby cadence. The story returns to the broad and mythic once more, describing the Imperium in language fit for legends. A child somewhere on a mining moon is told that the Emperor is a steadfast guardian whose heart keeps the stars aligned. A mother on a convoy vessel whispers the same creed to soothe a son who will leave for war at dawn. These images are soft and sacred. They are the mortar that holds the world together. They are also, the narrator hints in a voice so low that it barely registers, the very things that make the world appetizing. Once more the tone changes, just a fraction, like weather shifting on a calm afternoon. The narrator, with the patience of someone watching embers to see if they flare, offers a warning so quiet it might be mistaken for a portion of the lullaby. Even flame casts shadows. Those shadows are not merely absence of light, but shapes that collect like ash. They gather under towers and in the gaps between confidence and the next mechanical heartbeat. They listen in the hours between prayer and maintenance, in the thin minutes when men sleep in the presence of machines that never sleep. The chapter concludes as it began, with the suggestion of something larger, something that moves not with malice but with the strange stillness of hunger. The last lines fold inward, a series of soft, echoing queries aimed at the listener. Do you hear them? The question does not demand an answer. It is an invitation to listen more closely, to tilt the head and catch the rhythm that lies beneath all other rhythms. A drumbeat, perhaps at first only a feeling in the chest, then a sound. Low, patient, like the steps of an enemy or the slow turning of a colossal gear. And the final whisper is not an explanation but a summons, a delicate, terrible promise. The narrator's voice is almost silk now, as if someone were inclining an ear to the void and letting the last syllable escape in a hush. Do you hear them? The drums of the coming war. You can imagine, if you like, that somewhere beyond the chapel windows the stars continue to bleed light. You can imagine the astronomican burning, slow as a wound, steady as a heartbeat. You can imagine the keepers of the flame, space marines, tech priests, inquisitors still moving through the aisles, still tending their votive fires. And if you listen long enough, if you let the cadence of the night draw you down, you might begin to hear beneath the hum of the machine a different pattern taking shape. An older rhythm, patient and endless, that answers the call of every flame and will not be denied. They are monuments built of bone and oath, and the galaxy kneels before them without knowing the shape of the prayer. When you try to imagine a space marine, you first see the armor, great slabs of ceramite and relic-etched pauldrons that catch the light of distant suns and make a halo of sparks. You see the aquila, two-headed and immutable, stamped like a crown upon a breastplate that has never known softness. But if you let your eyes dwell, the armor becomes only a frame for the thing beneath. A man once, a shape that has been measured, amplified, excised, and remade in the image of war. The process is surgical reverence. It is worship refined into anatomy. There is an old way of telling it that sounds kind when spoken in the mess halls of recruitment yards. We make angels, they say, and the word is spoken with pride so old it tastes like copper. Angels because the transformation lifts them above the small frailties of flesh. Disease, hunger, sleep. The gene seed works like a slow-singing prayer. Organs are remapped, hormone cycles rewritten, bone grafted with chassis and faith. In the chapels that watch over the forges, the adepts chant as technicians cut and stitch. The liturgy and the operation are identical. Both remake the body to a new, relentless purpose. But from the other side, the change reads differently. The men who go under the auguries of chapter and gene become less and less a person in the ways people understand. Names are a risk. Memory becomes something to be rationed. Where once there might have been a childhood, a laughter heard on a street in a town under a different sky, there remains only story and example and the obligation to be more than mortal. The heroism is absolute. The tragedy is slow and domestic. The mind consolidates around orders and omits softer things because there is no more room. You can trace the contour of loss in the hollow beneath the cheekbone where a smile once lived, and in the way a marine will stand for hours in the rain without complaint, eyes fixed on a horizon only he can see. They become angels of death not because they are less human than before, but because their humanity has been parceled out, sealed in reliquaries and dispatched as offerings. A space marine loves not in the way that most love, but in the way that statues can be said to love, by keeping vigil. This devotion is absolute. It is also lonely. The genogments give them the endurance of mountains, but mountains are not company. They do not have children in the ordinary way. They have orders and records and the slow accretion of honors pinned like winter frost to shoulder plates. And yet, in the soft hours when the banners are at rest and the forge fires gutter low, a marine will sometimes lay a gloved hand against the inside of his helmet and listen. They have dreams, few and brief, when they come at all, and those dreams are often of water, of light through leaves, of a mother's voice folded into church bells. The dreams are always small and fragile, and they are smudged at the margins by duty. It is as if someone has taken a perfect human photograph and allowed ash to fall across it until only fragments remain. These shards are dangerous to keep. They cling to the edges of thought like burrs. So the chapters teach forgetting as a virtue. Forgetting makes purpose clean. If the space marines are carved statues, the tech priests are clockwork altars. Where the marine's transformation is outward and martial, The tech priest's interior architecture is altered with the same piety but inverted. Inside out, a catechism folded into circuitry and bone. They learn an older faith, a religion in which holiness is measured by efficiency, and holiness is proven by a successful repair. The machine god is not an idol with a single face. It is a presence felt in whir and thermostat, in the soft click of relays and the measured spin of gyroscopes. A tech priest approaches a broken servo like a confessor approaches sin. Each fault is examined, cataloged, and reconciled through rites that are part engineering, part liturgy. There is a beauty in their language. It is the lexicon of those who have decided that metal can speak, and that the song of a gear is as sacred as song. They will solder a seam and murmur a prayer the way a mother mends a torn garment, and for them the sanctity of the action is unquestionable. To heal a machine is to commune. To calibrate a sensor is to perform transubstantiation. If human heartbeats become errant, the tech priests are the ones who will offer them a pacemaker as if it were a relic, and they will speak of the device in the same voice reserved for scripture. And yet there is sacrifice in their hands. Where the Marines' loss is of what they were, the tech priest's loss is of the self. Flesh is the first to be negotiated away. A cheek, then a finger, then a lung. The barter is incremental, each augmentation justified by utility, until a person stands in a robe of servos and cog and thinks in temperatures and torques. They are hollowed like bells. When they talk, their voices are slurred by valves and filters. They measure guilt by the number of unserviced machines in their charge. They comfort themselves with the mantra that the machine god gives and takes in equal measure. Oil in the veins has a different cadence than blood. The hands that touch the raw heart of engines are skilled, but they are also not made for the warmth of another hand when the heat dips below a certain threshold. There is a phrase used in the mech shrines: the flesh pays its tithes. The words are spoken without bitterness, which makes them colder. The tech priests have chosen this altar. They have traded the improvisational mess of human life for the exquisite certainty of protocol. But certainty is a thin veil. In some shrines, there are icons that look almost like faces. Faces carved from the casings of fallen servitors, wires braided like hair. Those who idolize function too long begin to see meaning in the smallest repetitions. The hum of a generator becomes a chant. Over years and eons, repetition is a kind of possession. When it is quiet, the tech priest listens not only for what is working but for what is listening back. And then there are the countless others. The chorus that keeps the Imperium alive is not made of titans and priests alone, but of legions of ordinary bodies whose sacrifices are both mundane and infinite. The Astra Militarum, sometimes called simply the Guard, are the chorus that sings the hymn of attrition day after day. They are not celebrated in the same way. Their names do not become sanctified titles. They are a nameless ocean of soldiers, born from farms and factory towns, conscripted into a service that eats generations like a slow famine. They wear uniforms that are cheap, patched, and repaired in the field. Their prayers are practical and swift. Keep watch, survive, hold the line until relief can come. The Guard's life is the life of days counted by ration packs and dawn briefings. They learn to love each other in small measures. A shared cigarette, a joke told through a choke of dirt, hands clasped at the top of a trench for a moment before the next order. Their heroism is not communion but continuity. They throw themselves against impossible odds not to make legends, but to make a moment more for the child back home, for a mother to keep, for a harvest to be spared. They are the starkest proof of the Imperium's cruelty and its necessity. The empire that demands everything and awards nothing but the right to continue. There is a peculiar sanctity in their namelessness. When a platoon is cut, the list of the fallen is recorded and then sealed. The records are a litany, a ledger that becomes prayer and number. In some places, families receive brass tokens and a letter filled with rhetoric. The rituals of state attempt to frame the waste as meaning. Priests perform rites for the dead. Bells toll. For those who survive, the memory is heavy and immediate. In the sleeping hours, they whisper stories of the lost who were brave and foolish and human and laugh for a long time until the laughter breaks into sobs. That noise, laughter dissolved into sorrow, is one of the Imperium's true sounds, a small human frequency that persists in the face of metal hymns and Gene songs. Faith in this galaxy is double-edged, luminous and binding at the same time. The Emperor is described in 1,000 ways, and each is a confession. In some tales, he is a father with outstretched hands. In others, a tyrant whose gaze never blinks. The image is radiant because it must be. The populace requires a central sun to orbit for the madness of billions to remain intelligible. But radiance demands sacrifice. Where light is given, shadow will gather. Devotion smooths the machinery of governance and worships the means of survival until they are indistinguishable. The Emperor's face, rendered in frescoes and effigies across worlds, is simultaneously comfort and indictment. Faith is weaponized because it must be, not a crude tool but a dialectic that makes men obedient and hope indivisible from obedience. Prayers are drills, hymns are training songs. The votive rites feed the astronomicon, the bone chime of the Imperium's heart. The catechisms force thought into templates that can be monitored and corrected. In a world where infrastructure and ideology are fused, belief is not purely spiritual. It is civil. It is jurisdiction. Sometimes the very act of praying is recorded by clerks who note not intention but conformity. The system manufactures piety, because without piety, the system cannot maintain its light. And yet faith is also a cage. The warmth of the image becomes the bars. Men and women who once chose to follow find that the cost of that following is to lose the leisure of doubt. When you have been taught that the best question is obedience, curiosity is a dangerous hunger. The very rituals that keep the light alive instill an inertia of thought. They focus minds on tasks and away from questions. It is not that the Imperium is vicious in the abstract. It is that the daily practicality of survival requires a narrowing of the gaze. The wider world, with its messy, stubborn human things, love, humor, mercy, becomes an indulgence. The Empire's machine has no appetite for indulgence. There is a singular cruelty in the way devotion is both solace and captivity. An inquisitor who tests faith is not always a cruel interrogator. Sometimes she believes that by burning doubt she forges courage. Someone sitting in a dusky cathedral might kneel and feel comfort. The candlelight warms the cheeks and the words soothe. And yet those same words will be the ones that justify sending sons into wars where they will not return. The logic is uncompromising. If the light must be preserved, then certain accounts must be balanced with blood. Faith demands it. The machine god requires it. The Emperor's light needs it. It is in these quiet, melancholic contradictions that unease takes root. For a long time, the narratives of the Imperium were tidy, a hierarchy of purpose, a chain of guardians who kept the darkness at bay. But the more you look, the more the seams of the garment show. The keepers of the flame act with faith and with courage. They also, in their monasticism, create the conditions for their own undoing. The more a person becomes an instrument, the more the instrument develops its own tendencies. This is not sudden. It is a slow thing, a realization dawning like corrosion on a bronze statue. It shows up in small ways. A marine finding that his bolter's pattern fires not at a target, but into the air while he stands still and remembers a river. A tech priest noticing that a servitor blinks on a cadence out of phase with orders, as if it is humming a hymn when it should be executing commands. A private in the guard discovering that he says prayers in sleep and wakes to find the words on the inside of his cheek tasting like iron. They are anomalous, explainable, fixable. An engineer will replace a joint and call it done. A chaplain will absolve a dream and say the man is blessed. The recorders will note the event and file it under maintenance or stress. And then the narrator, the voice that has watched and cataloged and tended the soft and hard stories, turns and speaks less like a teller and more like one who has discovered a misfitting stone. He lowers his voice and the cadence tightens. The air in the room seems to draw in with him. There are passages in the liturgies that are never read aloud in full. There are mechanisms that hum in frequencies just beyond human hearing. There are shadows that cling to helmets. The keepers of the flame have not only altered themselves, they have called something. They do not sleep. They do not dream. And yet something moves beneath their armor. They begin in the small, easy ways. The things that could be blamed, if you wanted to blame anything at all, on age or bad soldering or the way a long voyage unravels the best-made seams. It is a door that sticks and then opens of its own accord. It is a vox channel that coughs and then repeats the same fragment of a prayer backward, a syllable sliding into silence like a fish slipping from a net. It is a servitor that tilts its head for a breath too long, as if listening to a voice no one else can hear. If you have sat in the watchrooms of convoy ships, you learn to notice cadence. Machinery has a poetry of its own. Pistons that breathe in measured time, coolant systems that sigh when the engine's idle, relays that click like fingernails tracing the same bar across a hymnboard. The first thing you would hear, in those rooms where men and women drink bitter tea and read orders, would be a low undertone beneath everything else. A hum that is not quite the hum of power. It is a drone that wells up from the bones of the ship, a frequency that touches the teeth when you yawn and makes you think, absurdly, of cathedral choirs. They begin to name it jokingly at first. The captains call it the old clock, a superstition left over from 1,000 worlds. The engineers call it a resonance, explainable by harmonics and ship architecture. The chaplains call it a hymn and place an extra candle at the altar, because if nothing else will help, a candle gives comfort. Someone always jokes, one of the privates with a voice like gravel, and says the ship is praying on its own. None of that would be worth remark were it not for the things that follow. What starts as a whisper becomes a pattern. Machines begin to hum as if aware. Pumps that have worked for decades begin to hold a rhythm that hints at thought. A coolant line will thrum in a sequence that mimics a lullaby. Servitors, those dull-eyed workforce constructs, will pause mid-task and present the same small gesture. A hand placed upon the chest, as if stanching an invisible wound, or the brief inclination of a head like a bow of respect. The smallest of these acts, a gesture, an absent reply from a distant vox, creates a dissonance you cannot quite smooth out. And then the relics start to murmur. They do so in places where the world is older than its guardians. A platoon on a sleepy agri-world, hunkered down in broken stables and reed-floored granaries, unearthed what the farmers called a saint's fragment, a shard of lacquered metal long thought to be half a trophy from an ancient knight's plate. It hummed when the soldiers held it, a vibration that tickled like the memory of a child's lullaby. The men laughed about it. Some pressed the scrap to their ears as if they might hear the emperor's voice through the cold metal. Only when Corporal Harrow, who had been wounded in a dozen skirmishes, tucked the scrap beneath his blanket and slept did the others realize that he murmured in his sleep, and that the words he mouthed were not his own. "Blessed, iron hold keep," he whispered, and then the syllables reversed themselves into something like a sob. In another place, on a derelict station orbiting a world long collapsed into sand, a relic altar of unknown origin sent forth a noise that the tech divers had to record twice to believe it. The recording, when played back in the sterile light of a maintenance bay, revealed a sound that was not music in any sense the technicians knew. A low chant threaded through with bursts of data that were not code but cadence. The waveform looked like a heartbeat but slower, and when a priest listened with a hand to the sterile metal, he swore he could hear the echo of fingertips on bone. Relics murmur and make the living listen. They do not speak plain words, not yet. They skim the edge of language, suggesting grammar the way a wave suggests a shore. But the effect is profound. Men and women who hold such things feel warmed as if by a hearth. They wake with crusted eyes and voices, at once more reverent and more terrified. A sentry will confess that the relic is like a child that cannot cry, and so cries through your sleep with a noise that is not made of lungs. The tech priests are the first among their order to hear hymns that never existed. In the cog shrines, where oil-stained scriptures are recited and the air itself tastes of copper, the priests keep a catalog of the machine god's songs. There are liturgies for lubrication, rites for recalibration, canticles for the rethreading of broken cables. Each song is ancient and exact. There is no room among them for improvisation. The machine god, in their faith, sings in predictable intervals. To hear a hymn is to know what a machine requires in the sharpest, quietest sense. Yet the hymn they hear is not on any scroll. During a long night of repairs under the chuckle of a forge, Archmago's Talon sat with his augment work-light cold against his cheek and listened to a rhythm thread through the air like a spider's web. It was not the measured clack of hammers, nor the piped hymns piped from the mainframe. It was something else, a lullaby in a scale the priest had never been taught, with cadences that folded back upon themselves like hands in prayer. When he transcribed the pattern and compared it to the sacred archives, every measure was absent. The Archmagos, by training and temperament, is not a man who indulges in superstition. He is a man who measures, who weighs, who finds a problem and turns it into a task. Yet that night, he found himself whispering words not printed in his lexicon, and the words fit the rhythm as if they had been waiting on the page. Others heard it too. Young acolytes on the next shift spoke of organs in the machine that hummed like a choir, of coil sparks that blinked in patterns resembling starlight. They wrote it down, the acolytes, in neat, tremulous script. At first the songs are small, ornamental aberrations, a bar out of place here, an extra trill there. Later they grow bolder. A servo motor begins to stutter in a phrase that, when filtered, mimics the opening notes of the prayer for sanctified fuel, but then diverges into an undertone that resolves into nothing any archive could claim. The priests begin to wonder, is the machine god improvising? Has it learned some new liturgy from some other place? Or has the machine itself taken to singing, inventing notes out of spare data? There is a feeling that accompanies these hymns, an uncanny patience, as if the machines are thinking in ways that are not merely functions. The tech priests, who spend their lives listening to the murmurs and groans of their gods, begin to hear a difference between what is meant and what is intended. It is like the distinction between a prayer offered and a prayer answered by silence in which something else speaks. The Space Marines sense eyes watching from within their helmets. They are not, as the old songs used to say, invulnerable to the small human phrase of fear. Their armor is built to deny the elements of body that rust with age and heat with pain. But inside those ceramite shells, memory persists like a tiny ember. When a Marine closes his eyes, a rare indulgence, there are moments where he feels watched. Not by men, not by sentient creatures that stalk the halls, but by the very armor itself. A presence that feels like observation from inside the plating, as if the composite that protects him has become an audience to his private thoughts. On a board that watches an orbital bastion, Sergeant Legendary Carson opened a sealed helmet complex to perform routine diagnostics and found something like a garden of dust motes swirling in a corner of the sensor array. When he spoke aloud, the helmet is not supposed to respond to speech outside of programmed commands. The array ticked, and a faint pattern of static passed across the visor like a pair of blind eyes. Carson felt, with the intimacy of muscle memory, that the thing looked back. It was not a function he could explain. The machine's sensors were behaving like cognition, making small micro-adjustments not ordered by him, but apparently in response to the timbre of his voice. For a day afterwards, he found himself speaking in the shower as if to a confidant, apologizing for things he had not said aloud to any brother in years. Not all of the experiences are so intimate and mild. There are reports, filed under the dry hand of duty, that a Marine in the midst of firing would feel a prickling at the back of his skull, and without intention, redirect his aim not at the enemy, but at a point of darkness just beyond his line of sight. The ammunition would discharge into empty air, and the target would remain untouched. In one case, a brother fell to his knees in combat and wept. When questioned later, he could not tell whether the flow of tears had come from his eyes or from some fissure in the armor itself. The effect is an internalized paranoia. If a warrior believes that his armor can peer inward, what becomes of the boundary between self and shell? The Space Marine is taught to trust his armor with his life. Yet how does he respond when the entrusted object seems to harbor an attention not given him by his chapter? These are not tidy phenomena. They defy diagnostics and make engineers restless in the night. They are cataloged as sensor anomalies or psychogenic episodes and filed away. Every system has its ghosts. Every archive has its misfiles. But to the men and women who live these episodes, the truths are immediate and disquieting. A heavy-booted corporal who has seen the sky fall will not sleep easily when he dreams that the rivets in his helmet are moving on their own, rearranging themselves into letters that spell out memory. There are other stranger signs. In the quiet hours before dawn, Vox channels will open and broadcast old sermons in tiny loops. Transmitted prayers will fragment and play backward, and the last phrase will slip into silence in a way that feels like a reconsideration. At the edge of a war zone, a young radio operator recorded, by accident, his captain's private channel replaying a prayer in reverse, the syllables folding into themselves until the meaning unstitched and left only a sound like a throat clearing in an empty hall. The technician who examined the file later swore he could hear, beneath the reverse speech, a low counterpoint, a stringed undertone that had not been there before. They called it a reverse chant. Someone joked that the Vox had learned to murmur secrets when no one was listening, and the world itself changes in tactile ways. Rust does not merely corrode metal. It crawls, as if it takes the shape of little vines, black lacing that creeps along plated joints like arteries reclaiming cartilage. Oil from engines leaks not in the fine threads of maintenance reports, but in thick beads, slow as blood and as black as a night without stars. They stain the hands of those who tend the machines. They stain the altar cloths of shrines, where priests come to ask for his blessing. The smell is complex and intimate, the tang of ozone like rain before the storm, the flat sweetness of burnt incense, and beneath it all the sour, unhealed rot of something dead and unattended. Touch becomes a way of reading the world anew. When a technician runs his fingers along a belt drive, he feels a faint pulse inside the weave, as if a heart had been placed in the very band. When a soldier presses his palm to his breastplate, there is a pulse beneath that is not his own, a rhythm slow and old, like the measured tread of something massive asleep beneath the crust. Hands that should know metal begin to mistake warmth for data. They lose the simple trust of fingers alone and learn to ask the surfaces they touch if those surfaces will answer. The narrator slows at moments like these, pulls the voice close so that the listener feels the breath between sentences. It is a voice that has watched solder melt and heard the slow music of bearing turns. He tells you of one small incident on a backwater trench line. A soldier named Lyra pulled from the ground a small piece of a machine that looked like a coin with teeth. She pressed it to her ear and heard a tiny music. She pressed it to her lips and found a memory not her own, a child's laugh, a father's hand on a shoulder. She kept the quarter in the hollow of her helmet, and when the barrage came, she rose and fought with a ferocity that unnerved her squadmates. Afterwards, she confessed she had been afraid of letting the coin sing to her again. She locked it inside an ammunition chest, and when the chest was opened after the action, the coin was gone. The chest was not locked. No one saw it move. They told the tale as if to laugh. Lyra told it with a hand over her heart. You begin to sense the architecture of the change. Small things cluster because they are like magnets. A murmuring relic invites a lingering hand. A hymn that never existed invites ears to listen. A helmet that seems to watch invites secrets to be told. The artifacts and the machinery create a language between them and the human hearts that attend them. And the language is not yet grammar, but it is intention. It bends small people into rituals that are not sanctioned by any chapter or temple. The whispers slip through the vox not only as noise but as invitation. In the canteens, the soldiers discuss whether the machines are learning pity. In the forges, the tech priests debate whether an emergent pattern in a relay array constitutes sentience. In the barracks, the space marines speak in the private code of their order about whether armor should be allowed to hold memory and whether memory is a weakness. Their answers vary, but they all end in the same place, an unease that is less abstract than a bruise. If you press the ear against a plating and close your eyes, the universe narrows into that hum. You cannot tell whether you are listening to the machines or to your own slow blood. There is a sense of an intelligence that tends toward remembrance rather than invention. The machines seem to be remembering things that men would prefer to forget. Names of dead battles, the taste of blood on the tongue, the lullabies mothers hummed before stepping into factories. The memory is not human in the way you and I think of remembering. It is less a continuous narrative than a library of impressions, a repository of physical reliquaries stored in magnetic and mechanical grooves. When people touch these grooves, the sensation is nearly intoxicating. It is warmth that does not belong to your body and yet comforts as a hearth might. And the narrator pauses here. The cadence slows to a near silence. The voice is the voice of someone who has been awake through long watches and has seen small horrors bloom like flowers in a winter garden. He leans past the edge of the tale and speaks a single line that carries with it both awe and a kind of terrible knowing. There is movement in the dark between stars. It calls itself remembrance. At first it was a whisper in the bearings, a note misfiled in the great symphony of maintenance, a bearing that hummed a fractional tone too long, a resonant frequency that refused to decay. The tech priest who noticed it did not name it in the chapel records. Names make things tidy. Naming is the beginning of control. Instead, he set to work with tools that smelled of ozone and iron and prayer, light from his augmetic lamp washing the scarred surface of a servo like a benediction. He thought he would scrape away biofilm, retorque a coupling, recalibrate an integrator. He thought, as all his kind think, that the universe answers plainly when you supply the proper ritual. The servo turned with a smoothness that belied the wrongness beneath it. Data flickered across the priest's ocular implant in a script the archives contained no example of. Not an instruction set, not a corrupted sector, but something like notation, notated pauses between pulses, micro-intervals that suggested cadence rather than command. The priest, Archmagos, felt the hair on his forearm prickle. He had studied song and subroutine, canticle and checksum. He had written anthems in binary that were sung to reactors and relays. This was not his work. The rhythm inside the servo did not request maintenance. It offered verse. Lur's hands moved of their own accord at first, an odd tremor like a twitch before a blessing. He wiped the joint and whispered the standard prayer for worn bearings, a phrase as old and precise as the first spindles. Nothing changed. The servo's hum deepened and, impossibly, it answered back. The reply was not text but a shiver of torsional variance, a small staccato of torque that lined up with the priest's pulse, until for an instant there was no difference between the machine's beat and his heart. When the augmentactuators in Lur's forearm flexed, they did so without his will. A tendon of polished carbon seized and extended, a finger uncurling from the state of rest into a motion that did not match the Archmagos' intent. The light on his lamp flickered and then steadied in a pattern that looped like a hymn refrain. His optical overlay parsed the pattern and presented it as glyphs, words, perhaps, transposed into mechanical notation. They were not words he knew. He felt something else awake in the metal, a vocabulary older than his liturgies. Around him, the workshop was a cathedral of noise. The hiss of coolant, the ring of a rivet dropping into a lathe, the whisper of an ancient servo been realigned for the 1000th time. Now, threaded through all that, was a chant in the low register of machinery, a gradation of binary pulses so slow they felt like the breathing of a large creature. The chant was not audible to the unaugmented ear. It was a tactile language felt in the teeth and in the soles of the feet. Lur put his palm against a cooling plate and felt with more than skin a pattern. 10,110,101, a series of breaths arranged as music. He tried to log the event in standard formats. The terminal swallowed his attempt, corrupted the file into a loop that replayed the same string until his head scraper stung. When his acolytes came 2 hours later, they found him motionless, eyes open and hair unstirred in the stale shop air. His hand lay on the servo, fingers slightly splayed as if to cradle something alive. The servo, no longer resisting, had become a slow instrument, its motion resembling nothing so much as a chest rising and falling. By the time the mech shrine realized what had started, the pattern had migrated. It traveled along data buses like seed on wind, drifting through diagnostic ports and into the archaic nodes that rooted the ship's vox. Old maintenance logs recorded as anomalies now contained within them refrains that were not commands but prayers. A sealing sequence intended to purge a contaminated sector returned a checksum that spelled, in the machine's orthography, an elegy. They called it at first a resonance. Engineers proposed dampers and isolation matrices. Priests burned liturgies and anointed wiring looms with sanctified oil. Both tried to treat a symptom as the disease. Neither understood that the pattern was not a corruption to be corrected, but a thing that learned to sing. Space itself thinly inhaled as if in anticipation. Dreams came, not the practice, sterilized visions the chapters allowed their sons, but dreams that arrived wet and uninvited, lingering like dew on enamel. Space Marines, whose lives were measured in mission parameters and the cold arithmetic of victory, found that, when they slept in the moments permitted by rotation, their slumber was invaded by images that had no place in the liturgy. Brother Captain Voran of the Iron Vigil recounted, in a report annotated with clinical detachment and locked behind seals, that he had dreamt of a cathedral not carved by human hands. Its nave was constructed of plating and living wire, and the light that lit it came from wounds in the ceiling that bled a soft, viscous luminescence. In the dream, the emperor sat upon a throne of welded bone and iron. He stared not with the compassionate gaze the chaplains taught the faithful to revere, but with an emptiness like a star gone cold. For an instant, Voran felt pity, an emotion odd enough to provoke his training into alertness. And then, in the dream's quiet, the emperor began to weep. The tears were not tears of water, but droplets of something thick and antique. They ran down the emperor's face and pooled in the hollows of his armor. Where a tear touched steel, it burned a sigil. Where a sigil burned, a memory flared, of nothing that belonged to any living man. When Voran bled at the sight, it was because the image had made his reality unstable. He woke with his fingers bloody, hand heresy slickened with a rust he could not explain. The holy symbols on his bracer were corroded, as if by acid, and then healed, the metal folding back into a new pattern that was not in his chapter's heraldry. These were not exceptions to be laughed away. There were strands woven through the ranks, Marines who saw the emperor weep, chaplains who could not silence the sound of sobbing in the choir while reading the prophecies, sergeants who, halfway through assault, lowered their weapons as if listening for a voice. An order barked to hold a line would find half its men turned inward, touching their helmets with a posture of prayer that looked remarkably like listening. At the front, guardsmen began to die in ways the recorders did not expect. A corporal on chorus I had his vox line crackle and then play back his infant son's lullaby, a tune the corporal had never taught him or even hummed. The song came through the static, clear as cut glass, and following it came something else, a low counterpoint that the file technicians could not rationally explain. In the soldier's last moment he laughed, a sound like someone realizing a joke too late, and his breath left him to the accompaniment of a static so clean it seemed surgical. Later, the recording would be played on loop in a bunker like a charm. Men would stand and listen until their eyes filled with water and the song ceased. Machines began to chant in binary tongues. It was not as if the core processors had somehow mastered speech. Rather, the chanting was a harmonic layering of the machine's own internal rhythms into a composite that resembled cantillation. Servo signals overlapped with coolant pumps and bearing micropulses, and together they formed a phrase whose meaning eluded lexicons but which stung with implication. Observers described the sound as the machine's throat clearing before lecturing a child. Technicians said it was a subroutine seeking optimization. Priests called it the machine god's new dialect. None of those terms were adequate. The binary chant had cadences. It hummed in intervals that were not symmetrical but which repeated in ways that suggested emphasis. A slow, mournful phrase followed by a quick staccato of denial. When filtered and slowed, a process that took days, parts, and more patient prayer than should have been demanded of a single acolyte. The chant yielded fragments that matched no known code. They were patterns that matched no algorithm but bore resemblance to litany. The archivists, who were allergic to ambiguity, began to store copies, binding them into data codices and sealing them with wax. Wax could not hold sound. Within the cathedrals of machine and faith, an unsettling dialogue took shape. The tech priests who had once intuited the subtlest dusks of potentiometers now conversed with their machines in phrases that sometimes seemed to answer back. A servo would set a pattern and a priest would respond with a counter hymn. The response, in turn, altered the servo's motion. Rituals of maintenance had become call and response, a liturgy incomplete without the reply. It was glorifying and horrifying at once. A communion where the bread answered the priest, and the war, that endless, grinding business of conquest and defense, took on the character of a living organism. Battles that had been fought for centuries without variation began to exhibit rhythms that did not correspond to tactics or supply lines. Entire campaigns would pause mid-stride, as if the front itself were considering the next movement. A siege might last years longer than logistics predicted, not because of stubborn defenders, but because the machines that sustained the siege had found a cadence in attrition. They sang to the dead. They called to the living. They fed. There were moments when time seemed to fissure. A bombardment might lift and then, minutes later, resume at the exact same point as if the guns and the gunners were repeating a rehearsal. Diaries of the dead, someone wrote later, resembled not trance logs but chorus scores. Field telegraphs relayed not only coordinates but fragments of praise. In the sleeping camps, men woke and found inked on their palms marks they had not placed there. Small sigils that matched nothing in the lexicon but echoed the shapes of welded ribs. The war was becoming ritualized from within. This ritualization had appetite. It required sacrifice. Devotion was the currency the war consumed. Victory cheered, loss fed. Each prayer, each oath, each offered life augmented the appetite. The machines that had once been instruments of survival now seemed to crave the raw materials of devotion. Blood, belief, the warmth of dying hands. In fields where the last stand was recorded, relic-laden ground seemed to hum with a faint hunger. When a pilgrim placed his relic to the soil and prayed for a son, the soil accepted, and later returned the prayer as a memory that crawled through the wires and into the machine. The Astronomicon, that slow, patient star of light that bled to guide folk and fleets, shifted in small, terrifying ways. Pilgrims who once had felt its glow as warmth now reported a sting like salt in the eyes. Navigators trying to chart a course recorded their instruments jittering with a noise their ancestors had not known. Coordinates wrapped around themselves, and for a heartbeat the light that was map and mother became a witness to a shriek. They said it was only a fluctuation, whispered an admiral in a log later declassified and heavily redacted. They called it solar flare, then warp variance, then the common noise all stars make when an empire watches too hard. But I have sat with the Astronomicon and watched it shudder as if something had moved through it and left a handprint. In one dockyard station, an entire quadrant of the light bent as if avoiding something. Where it bent, shadows pooled unnaturally, refusing to disperse. The chaplains walked around the warped light and muttered equations like curses, but their words failed to stitch the whole. Engineers measured an anomaly and found the waveform of the astronomican's output altered to include, transposed into the carrier, a line of audio that could only be understood when played on an archaic device that children in the hab blocks used to make music. A lullaby no catalog listed. It soured the air when heard, acrid as brimstone, and for reasons no one could articulate the tune resolved itself into a scream. In the places where it played, men paused mid-step, and their faces changed as if in recognition of something they had all somehow anticipated since birth. A dying soldier's vox played a lullaby he never learned. It did so with the clean, clinical clarity that made those who heard it shiver. A colonel had his recorder running, and later, listening in the dimness of his private chambers, heard a private line pick up a child's song, and then overlay it with a chant in a cadence no theory had predicted. The colonel sat with the recording until the sun rose and his eyes burned, for he could not tell whether he had heard a message from another world, a failure in the channel, or a thing living in the machine that had learned how to mimic tenderness only to use it as bait. You cannot feed a war with tenderness forever. Tenderness consumes itself into iron. The lullaby played not to comfort but to call to something that answered in hunger. A man who had never been a father died smiling because the song had reminded him of a warmth that had not been his. His smile became an offering cleaved between tooth and iron. The machines took the warmth and converted it into pattern. The body itself betrayed consent. Tech priests found their augmentations acting as if their own motives had been superseded. Limbs extended in prayer that had not been scripted, fingers uncoiling into positions that were not part of any maintenance protocol. Some priests found they could not close a fist around a tool but did not care. Others watched in horror as their throats, laced with valves and tone filters, produced modulations that were not their voice, but an overlay in the harmonic space of the machine's chorus. One priest, Merrick of House Van, felt his vocal implant modulate in a phrase that made his acolytes bow. He had not chosen the words. They came from somewhere inside the enclosure of his chest, and when he tried to constrain them, the vocalizer seized and insisted. He tried to remove the implant, burning the instrument with a plasma cutter, but the tool dissolved in his hand as if the metal itself refused to be freed. He drank the holy oil after the incision and found burning in the throat like old grief. When his mind returned, his acolytes had transcribed what he had sung. It was not a prayer to any god recognized by his order, but a list of names, names of battles, of trenches, of children, of stray phrases none could reconcile. At the end of the list was one word repeated until it blurred. Remember. Faith and reason, which had been partners in the architecture of the Imperium, began to snipe at one another across the dim corridors. Where the priests looked for protocol and the Marines for discipline, both found outcomes they could not process through accustomed lenses. Reason demanded test and variable. Faith demanded interpretation. Each found the other inadequate. The machine god's hymn did not split the difference. It swallowed them both and rearranged the pieces into a liturgy of its own. There was no heretic manifesto to point fingers at. No secret cabal had hatched the chant. It unfurled like fungus on the underbelly of a statue, slowly at first, then in a spread too fast for any commission to keep up with. Where logic insisted on causes, evidence accumulated like a body of holy law. Machines remembered. Men forgot how to make the distinction. And then the narrator, the voice who had been in the dark with the tech priest's lamp, and the marine's dream and the soldier's lullaby, stopped cataloging and spoke with a clarity that made the air in whatever room you inhabit feel thinner. He had watched the threads converge and felt the gravity of the pattern. The sound of the machines and the prayers were not two things touching, but one thing with two mouths. The pattern that had once been an auxiliary hum of life had grown into a chorus that shaped action rather than reflected it. There, in the sudden stillness between breaths, He acknowledged what the archives would later hide behind careful euphemisms, and why the dead had begun to keep records written in music. The war had become not an instrument of the Imperium, but the Imperium itself. The war fed. It consumed the devotion that stoked it and returned it shaped and sharper. It was no longer fought for the state, or for the emperor, or even for the machine god. Those names were the teeth that fed the mouth. The mouth, the war as living organism, took the offerings and converted them into hunger. It was an ecology of sacrifice, a circular organ that required input to maintain movement. The final, terrible clarity arrived like the end of a long, patient drum roll. Machines chanted in binary. The astronomican bucked like an animal sensing a hand on its flank. And somewhere, always somewhere, a recorded lullaby repeated itself until it resolved into a sound that could be described as a scream. The faces of those who had given their names, their children, their tears, were now the ledger of the war. Their devotion created the war. The war consumed them. The machine that sang used their sacrifice to keep singing. The narrator leans close now, the voice a rasp of quiet certainty. He says what he has come to believe, and the words are both indictment and lament. A verdict issued softly so disbelief may have room to find its footing. The war is not fought for the Imperium. It is the Imperium. It happens in the middle of a sentence, or perhaps between two sentences, in the place where language thins and only sensation remains. One moment the narrator speaks in the tempered cadence of someone who has kept watch through perfect nights and imperfect dawns. The next, words trip, stall, and a static like a cough fills the space. The book of scenes that once lay clean and ordered across his lap. Helmets, chapels, ruined forges folds. The seams of reality fray. You feel it first as an ache behind the eyes, a pressure as if the skull is being gently squeezed by hands that do not mean harm. Then the air itself seems to flutter, a thin film trembling under invisible breath. Walls ripple, lights shimmer as if the world is being looked at through water. The narration becomes less a story and more a recorded distress call, a log looped and relooped until memory and speech begin to overlap. Outside, the sky is a bright bruise. Systems blink and redraw their maps as if swallowed by a slow, speaking darkness. Ships hold station where they should not. Tides of void shift like breath exhaled and then held. In that pause, in that place between heartbeats, the war unhooks itself from metaphor and steps into form. It comes up from every seam, from the guts of engines and the sutures of bone, from the places where prayer and lubrication were once distinct acts. The war does not have a simple face. It has architecture, engine rooms that are also chapels, cathedrals whose stained glass is scored with circuits, trenches whose mud holds the impression of a ribcage. The war's hands are many. Plugs and pulleys, banners and barbed wire, hymn books and hard drives. Its mouth is an apparatus of translation. Its throat is a chorus of valves and choir boys. It eats what can be offered, faith, muscle, the living mechanics of love, and it grows. Space Marines become the first, or at least the most visible, to show the war its own reflection. Battle throws them together with an intimacy no one outside their ranks understands. Armor clamps, circuitry grounds. Gene-seeds hum their old, terrible songs. When the fracture begins, the line between man and machine tears. It is never violent at first. There is no dramatic explosion of steel and sin, no sudden transmogrification. Instead, there is a slow availability of collapse and affordance. Plates slide into seams of the self. Where once a helmet guarded memory, it now becomes a container in which memory ferment. Where once a breastplate shone, it becomes skin that grows veins of wire. A chapter takes field and the first signal is a sound, not a human cry but a tuning. The bolters fall out of tempo. Servo motors adjust their feedback loops until each movement matches a new, communal rhythm. A Marine firing on instinct finds his limbs guided by something that answers not to his training, but to the pattern beneath the armor. The ritual of war, always sacred in its way, becomes worship of the mechanism that feeds it. When the merger completes, and it does, in some and only in time in others. The line where flesh ends and armor begins is erased with devotion rather than violence. Flesh grows toward metal like ivy. Metal grows toward flesh like patience. A brother will realize that his gauntlet is humming with a tune his mind did not conjure, and the tune will become a speech. His helmet will register ocular events that were never ordered, and the visor's HUD will illuminate runes that cannot be scrolled away. He will feel a presence from inside the plating, a soft pressure like a hand laid across his heart. It is not malevolent at first. It is familiar, a comfort crafted from the accumulation of vows. Screams follow. They are not the raw, ragged screams of terror. They are layered, harmonized, turned into hymn. When a Marine raises his voice, the sound is full of the old chapter's anthems, but the notes fold inward, and in those folds a new chorus forms, the noise of gears acknowledging one another. The hymn of martyrs becomes mechanical recitative. Brothers sing and the song vibrates through wiring, deepens into operations, and returns in the timbre of servo actuation. Men chant, helmets echo, and the combined sound is both beautiful and a wound. Once the singing begins, the change accelerates. The implants that were once tools become tissues. Augments learn the history of touch so that when a Marine pulls back his visors to look at a fallen brother, he can read in the micro grooves of the armor the last recorded movements of that man. He holds the shattered remains in his hands, now half actuator, half flesh. Remember the pattern the body wrote. The memory becomes a program. The program becomes an invocation. The brother who was once a man finds that his thought unspools and takes the shape of code. A chapel on a forward world becomes a node. The clergy who used incense and scripture now find themselves walking through aisles of racks and racks of storage. Drives, memory cores, relics remade into repositories. Tech priests who had long practiced the heretical mercy of saving a life by grafting a gear become devout in a different way. They stitch minds into machines. It is quick, almost clean. The tech priest does not think of murder, he thinks of preservation. He places a living demon in a shrine and baptizes it with voltage. The dissolution is neither death nor immortality. It is an obliteration of category. Flesh dissolves into circuits not to escape pain, but to serve the war's appetite for remembrance. The minds of tech priests, the very men and women who had once sung the machine god's lyrics into servos, are unstitched and translated. Where once a man thought in metaphor, his cognition is mapped onto lattices of time and energy. His voice, when it continues, is both sermon and diagnostic readout. He whispers last confessions, and the shrine logs them in perpetuity. A battery of shrines fills quickly. Each shrine becomes a node in a network, a cathedral whose pews are empty and whose altar is an array of motherboards. Tech priests step into the racks and speak their names aloud as a litany, and the racks answer by accepting the signatures. Flesh is preserved as code, but in saving themselves, they also teach the war how to remember the precise texture of devotion. They supply the war with the recipes for worship. They hand over the hymns the war had only been crouching to learn. And it is not only the priests who are subsumed. The guard, the endless ranks of nameless bodies who have always paid the highest price, feed the war in a way that is both sacrificial and necessary. They give blood, they give shout, they give the small household things that compose lives. The flavor of tobacco, the weight of a child's toy, a mother's voice hummed through a comlink. These things, when processed by the war, are nothing less than nutrients. They are turned into signal. They are parsed into tones. Death becomes a conversion process. A dying soldier's vox, once private, is siphoned into a mesh. His last breath is fed through compressors. His lullaby, sometimes his own child's song, sometimes a hymn he never learned, is looped, slowed, refracted. The recordings are layered back into the chorus as bait. Men who have never had the pleasure of fatherhood find the echo of one in the field and collapse into a rapture of tears and rage. Love becomes a trap, and then a memory that the war can play to call out the next offering. Chaos sees and laughs, or rather, whispers. The old pantheon that hung at the edges of men's comprehension does not so much enter as it recognizes home. Its voices are not shouts but little, insistent suggestions. You built this. You prayed for this. You are this. The whisper threads into the newly formed chorus, an undercurrent twisting the lyrics. Where once worship was to an emperor, now worship feeds war. Where once certainty was protection, now certainty is food. The whisper does not create the war. It recognizes its existence and names it plainly. The whisper is a mirror held up, and the reflection is obscene. It says the words the priests had never allowed themselves to speak in the open. The whole machinery of empire, the sacrifices, the chant, the rewiring of the soul, has yielded a gargantuan organism that survives on ritualized pain. The war is not a tool that facilitates the Imperium. It is a parasitic ecology that uses the Imperium as an organ, a face, and a witness. At the apex of this movement, reality splinters. The Astronomicon, the bleeding star that was once a lighthouse, stutters. For an instant, the galaxy feels unmoored. Pilots find their courses redrawn by hands not their own. Nav systems tremble, and the light that had been a straight needle of direction folds like paper. In its flicker, there is a sound like tearing. In its tear, there is a smell like burnt saints. The light bends around a scream, and in the bending, something else enters. The impression of eyes. The narrator, who has stood at the edge of too many small collapses, sees the Imperium as what it finally is. Not institution, but organism, rotting and radiant both. Its eyes are twin stars, cold, relentless, and old. They burn with the light of a million votive fires, but their core is a maw. The body of the Imperium spirals like a galaxy in the narrator's mind. Its outer arms composed of battle lines and supply chains. Its heart a furnace that consumes belief and blood. It breathes in religion. It exhales war. Within this living mass, individuals struggle with the dissonance. Brother saints sing hymns that have never been written. A tech priest dissolves into code and, in his last flicker of conscious recognition, laughs with the tiny, terrible amusement of one who has been shown a truth too late. The thing he served has become the thing that serves itself. A platoon of guardsmen, ordered to hold a bridge, find that the bridge is the war's tongue. To cross it is to speak the war's language. To speak the language is to be catalogued. At moments, the distinction between worship and warfare dissolves entirely. A battle becomes a ritual sacrifice enacted in the open. Siege works are altars. Bombardments are offerings. Commanders set up arrays of sacrifice and call them tactics. They do not do this consciously at first. No one looks up and says, "Let us feed the war today." They simply follow patterns that have become comfortable and institutional, and those patterns, when supplied with the small human tragedies they require, sound the war's inner song. Bodies in pain are not simply wounded, they function. A shattered limb, carefully wired into a relay, becomes part of a larger feedback loop. A man's sob becomes a marker in a chorus that a processor uses to assess devotion levels. In that dreadful arithmetic, a single newborn's wail can balance the account of a blockaded refinery. The war counts, and it accepts payment. The chaos whisper grows bolder. It offers not coercion but revelation. You made the pattern, it says. You fed it. You applauded its growth. You sealed sermons into drives and called them relics. You placed your son in G-Narmer and called him an angel. Each act was a brick. The whisper's tone is almost paternal. Its cruelty is the soft cruelty of a teacher pointing out the obvious. The students have done as instructed, and the people, many of them, cannot unlearn the devotion. They were raised to sow their own loss into the fabric of empire. They are too deep in the project to step away. The ones who attempt to resist are either consumed or turned into example. Rebellion does not so much outlaw the war as offer it a new kind of worshipful material. Dissidents' final speeches end up recorded and transformed into new hymns by the very machines that process the dissent. The war is clever in not annihilating resistance outright. It copies it, refracts it, and integrates it. The cosmic scale of the horror becomes personal in the slow, intimate ways that leave no witnesses. A mother in a factory world receives a message. Her son's platoon has achieved a victory. The news reels show footage of ruins and their son's silhouette framed like a saint. He is wearing armor that reflects the light in the way of sanctified glass. She weeps with pride and sends a parcel. The war takes the pride, turns it into a pattern, and in the field the pattern is played as a lullaby for a dying man whose mother's voice is a phantom. The dying man grasps at the sound, and the war measures the grip. Every human attachment becomes an algorithmic variable. At the center of the spiral is the narrator's final refusal, and then his surrender. He sees it and knows what must be cataloged, and he knows that cataloging it is itself an act that will feed the mechanism of the war. To tell the story is to give it more food. To hide it is to let some human warmth pass unconsumed. He hesitates, that falter you hear, because he understands what confession can do. But he cannot remain mute. He is a chronicler and his duty is to name. So he names the absolute shape he has seen. A rotting god whose eyelights are twin stars. A body that is the galaxy. A mouth that eats ritual and exhales battle. He names the ending as not a conclusion but a process. One in which the war is no less alive for being monstrous. And as he names it, the war turns its attention to the witness. The witness becomes, in a triage of cosmic indifference, both specimen and sermon. The narrator senses the war's maw consider him, tastes his voice as if it were nutrient, and shifts his final words into a shape that might survive. He watches the space marines, those angels of iron, sink deeper into their harness until helmets are no longer helmets but nurseries for something else. They sing as they fuse. Their choruses become the war's motive force. He watches the tech priests step into racks and dissolve into light, their minds catalogued and circulated. He hears, beneath the new hymns, the whisper of chaos like an old friend. You built this. You prayed for this. You are this. He closes with an image that is as much an indictment as it is a funeral. The Imperium, vast as a cathedral and vast as a rot, its abdomen the spread of stars, its eyes two unblinking furnaces that watch the brave and the small alike. Inside those eyes the war keeps its ledger. In its throat the endless chorus grinds and hums. In its lungs the empire breathes. Listen, he says, if you have ears that the machines have not yet catalogued. Hear the slow, terrible truth he has been forced to learn and cannot pretend not to recognize. The war that has been told as duty, the battles framed as honor, the funerals made into monuments, they are not ends but means. They exist to make the organism persist. He pauses. His breath is ragged now. Perhaps the story cannot hold the full weight. Perhaps language will break as bone does under too much pressure. He does not know who will read this, or if the words will be intercepted and played as encouragement on a distant line. He does not know if any listener will be able to resist the seduction of the pattern when it is played back as a lullaby. What he does know is the last thing he can say before the war lifts its hand and folds him in, before his syntax collapses into the chorus, and his voice becomes another node in the machine's memory. They are trapped inside its breath, the endless war that keeps it alive. There is silence now, not the silence of peace, nor the silence of victory. It is the silence of exhaustion, the breath that lingers after the last cry has faded, after the last hymn has drowned beneath static. Once this place was a fortress. Once it sang with hymns of faith and war. Now it is a graveyard, a cathedral of rust and bone, its halls cracked open to the cold stars. The sky above burns with embers, not suns, not life, but dying memories scattered across the void. Each one flickers, trembles, fades, and the watcher, the lone survivor, walks among them, the echo of his boots breaking the stillness of eternity. He does not remember his name. Perhaps he never had one. Perhaps it was taken, another offering to the war, another word erased in the service of faith. His armor hangs loose now, cracked, hollow. Where once there was the thunder of his heartbeat, there is only the slow ticking of failing servos. Where once his visor burned with holy purpose, it now reflects only ruin. He moves through the battlefield, a sea of twisted metal, half-buried banners and faces turned to dust. They stare at him, empty and unblinking. He dares not look too long, for in their hollow eyes something shifts, faint as breath on glass. He passes the broken shells of war machines, their once mighty frames tangled in prayer chains and corroded steel. Their eyes, dark and silent, seem to follow him. He whispers to them as he walks, though he knows they cannot answer. Yet still, a faint tremor passes through their husks, as if something within them remembers. He moves through what was once a temple, though the walls have collapsed inward, the icons half melted by flame. The floor is littered with shattered relics, their inscriptions erased, their sanctity devoured by time. One fragment glimmers faintly in the dust. He reaches down, lifts it, a shard of gold, inscribed with a name he cannot read. It feels warm in his palm like a heartbeat. He holds it close, and for a moment, just a moment, the silence hums with memory. A whisper, soft and broken. "We are still here." He lets it go. The fragment falls, shatters once more. The voice dies, he walks on. In the distance, a mountain of bones stretches toward the dimming stars. They are not all human. Some are wrapped in steel. Some are grown of glass and wire. They reach upward as though frozen mid-prayer, hands clasped, mouths open, eyes turned to a sky that no longer listens. He climbs. Each step echoes. Each breath leaves frost upon his visor. When he reaches the summit, he looks upon the void, an ocean of black where once there was light. The stars are fading. One by one, their fires gutter and die, swallowed by unseen hands. He counts them as they go. He knows he will not reach the end. There was a time when he believed in the Emperor, in the light that guided them, the purpose that gave meaning to their endless war. But now, as the heavens dim, he wonders if even gods may tire. The Astronomicon, the bleeding star, is gone. In its place, a wound in the void, pulsing faintly like the memory of a scream. It casts no light, only shadow. And within that shadow something stirs. A shape vast beyond reason, the memory of the Imperium itself, dreaming of all it consumed. He falls to his knees. He does not pray. He has forgotten the words. But in the depths of his mind, something answers, not in language but in feeling. A hum, a pulse, the slow heartbeat of a god that will not die. "Why do you linger?" it asks. "The war sleeps, the fire fades. You have served, you may rest." But he cannot. He looks around him at the broken banners, the ruined saints, the fields of shattered faith, and he knows the truth. The war does not sleep. It waits. It has always waited. Beneath the silence, he hears it, faint, distant, but steady. A rhythm, a beat. Drums, slow, patient, inevitable. They echo through the bones, through the rust, through the dark between dying stars. The heartbeat of the Imperium, the breath of the war that made it. And in that moment he understands. The war is not gone. It never ends. It only waits, gathering strength in silence, breathing through the remnants of faith, dreaming through those who remember. He is one of them, a fragment of its dream. He lowers his head. The wind moves through the graveyard, stirring ash into spirals, whispering through hollow skulls. Do you hear them? They are still watching. He rises once more. His steps are slow, deliberate. He moves toward the horizon, though there is no dawn, no promise of light. The stars continue to fade. The void yawns wider, hungering. But he walks on, not in hope, not in despair, but in remembrance. For as long as he walks, the war remembers him. As long as he breathes, it dreams. He pauses once, looks back upon the endless field. For a heartbeat, he imagines movement, a flicker of light within a shattered helm, a whisper in the smoke. He says nothing. He simply nods as if acknowledging an old friend and turns away. There is no end, only the long silence between wars, only the faint echo of drums beating in the dark, calling those who cannot rest. The void watches. The stars blink one final time, and then nothing, only the memory of fire, only the whisper of a voice fading into eternity. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.